not at all.
That made college football good.
That's what made it. Yeah, that's why it's the most popular game in America.
Make this big money.
Yeah.
But now if they're making big money already, they're not going to play the same.
And if you went to LSU or Tennessee or somewhere, you went because you wanted to play for that school. And now nobody stays anywhere. Just saw a thing that Stanford University did. For every player that enters the transfer portal, almost 70% of them move twice. And you're playing ball for 4 years. I mean, I don't even know how that works as far.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that's not what we're talking about tonight, folks. For whoever decides to watch this crazy thing. I got to turn it on up here. Oh, let's see. There we go. We are going to begin in chapter 10. Chapter 10. We got through basically the first two sections. This is the tail end of the last section of Hosea. So there's the two sections that the first section is all about Hosea and his wife Gomer and the allegory that's provided there for us. God pursuing his adulterous people who have gone to sleep with other paramours, is the way that the word actually translates out of the Hebrew, but they've gone to be with the God that they believe is providing what they need. So in today's language, it would be a sugar daddy. Okay, they had gone to give themselves over to their sugar daddy, and that he was going to provide everything that they needed. And of course, all the way through this thing, God is reminding them of what he's done and just how terrible their sin is. And when we read through what's sometimes called the doom and gloom prophets, because all they do is doom and gloom, when we read through them and we read all this stuff, and it's so horrible, it's so bad, and you kind of get numb to what the prophet's saying from our perspective. But then you begin to remember that what God is describing is our infidelity and just how utterly destructive it is for us, as his people, when we steer away from him and choose to follow other gods, and how he's hurt by it. His compassion is welled up because of it, but at the same time, he has to do something that is just in this, because we're not allowed to just do anything we want. Contrary to popular belief today, we're just not allowed to do that, and if we were, then that would be ultimate freedom, right? You could just do whatever you wanted, and it would be even God in his position. If he had never told us to do anything different, and we just did what we wanted, he would even see that as ultimate freedom. But we know, and he knows, the destructive nature of it. So he provides us with a way to live. And then knowing the difference between right and wrong, knowing a morally good thing to do, now lays responsibility for what we know, not necessarily what we should do with it. So obedience for the sake of obedience is just being a slave to obedience. But being obedient for the sake of what is right and what we know is an entirely different thing.
Is this where you got your post?
Well, it all came together with me. That was that just came up in the Oswald Chambers, but it just,
That was so good.
yeah, and I'd been thinking about this same thing, how these people knew the difference. They knew what was morally good. And we've seen it now, Amos, Micah, and now Hosea. The way that they treat each other, the way that they treat what they tried to hold as a fidelitous religion. We're doing all the right stuff. Why can't God be happy with that? So totally missing the substance of what all of this is about, and it is life with God. So when we, I don't know if you'll be interested, but after I finish this experiencing God thing, I'm going to go through the book Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Life Together in my Sunday morning class. And it is, if you've never read it, you can get it on a PDF. I've got a link for it somewhere. Anyway, if you want it, I can send it to you. It's a PDF. Don't have to pay for the book. Read it online or download it. You're able to download it. And it's one of the classic, it's a Christian classic. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote this while life together. It was during Nazi occupation of Europe, and he had gone back to Germany from America to serve in a kind of an underground seminary to continue to train ministers that were outside the official church, if you know anything about that history, and ultimately became involved in, he lived with 25 other teachers, and he wrote this book, Life Together, out of that experience. It's so good. And then ultimately he got involved in an assassination plot to kill Hitler, and got real close to succeeding, but was arrested. I think he was in prison for about 6 months, and then it was about 6 months, and it was hanged like days before the prison was liberated. So it was tragic. But anyway, so when we understand this life together and what God is making out of it, and how utterly unique it is in all the world, we should be able to adjust life in order to be a part of that, because you can't find it anywhere else. And this is what they were unwilling to do. They had literally or literarily gone to bed with the other man, and now God was having to deal with that. So chapter 10 is kind of the end of that middle section that speaks of all this, of comparing their sin and comparing his love and stuff. And we're going to see a little bit of the up and down, the in and out motion that we talked about at the beginning, where we're drawn stark attention to the sin, and then we receive this blast revelation of what God is going to do to bring us back to him. So it says, Israel is a lush vine. It yields fruit for itself, meaning not for me. The more his fruit increased, the more he increased the altars of Baal, the altars of Asherah. Okay? The better his land produced, the better he made the sacred pillars. Their hearts are devious. Now they must bear their guilt. So he's if you remember earlier, about in the middle of this section, it's kind of like he's called court. He said, I've come to bring a case against you. And he's kind of, Hosea is writing in that vein for God, in that same kind of argument. Their hearts are devious, and so now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars and demolish their sacred pillars. In fact, they are now saying, we have no king, for we do not fear the Lord, meaning that nobody tells us what to do. Okay? So they had a king, and he was terrible. So this is the this is the spectral nature of it, is that they didn't have God as king, and they had no king in Samaria that they really respected. It was kind of a wide open deal. It says, what can a king do for us? They speak mere words, telling false oaths while making covenants. So lawsuits break out like poisonous weeds in the furrows of the land. This gets back to their how their moral ingratitude toward God is producing ethical failures in the land. They're cheating each other, and they're spending all their time suing each other. Does any of this sound familiar? You can just go, it's just we haven't learned a thing. We say that a lot, but every time you come across a passage like this, we're reminded lawsuits break out like poisonous weeds in the furrows of the field, meaning that it infects everything that is good. Everything that is to produce is no longer able to produce because there's so much subterfuge and evil against one another. The residents of Samaria will have anxiety over the calf of Bethaven, their idol. Indeed, its idolatrous priests will rejoice over it. The people will mourn over it. over its glory. It will certainly go into exile. So this is what they're saying. He says, when you're finally taken over, all these idols that you think are so valuable to you, they literally were chopped up and carried back as loot. Okay, so that's what he's referring to. The calf itself will be taken to Assyria as an offering to the great king. Ephraim will experience shame. Ephraim's the same as the northern kingdom. Israel will be ashamed of its counsel. Samaria's king will disappear like foam on the surface of the sea. Isn't that crazy? So when this exile finally happens, you never hear of these people anymore. They don't come back at the end of the exile. They are just they're watered down. They intermarry. They're shipped off to nations we don't even know where all of them wound up, because at that time Assyria's control over the known world extended all the way into Macedonia, nearly all the way to India, to the southern regions of Iraq. So this is a big area. And then when the Persians finally got a hold of it, it even expanded more. And they were spread out everywhere. So their king was just going to be dissipated. I love that picture, like foam on the surface of the water. The high places of Avon, the sin of Israel, will be destroyed. Thorns and thistles will grow over their altars. They will say to the mountains, cover us, and the hills fall on us. You probably heard that, because that's a passage that John quotes in the Apocalypse from Revelation. Revelation chapter 6. Well, maybe this right here. Revelation chapter 6. So he's quoting Micah there, pleading for the only relief that they're going to get after all of this is for literally the mountains to fall on them, to crush them, to kill them. So, Israel, you have sinned since the days of Gibeah. Now, anybody know what happened at Gibeah? This goes all the way back to Judges. This is the event. You remember when the concubine was caught and they chopped her up into pieces and spread her all over the land? You know, all right, that's the story out of Judges chapter 17, I believe, 16 or 17, in that area, and it was a terrible thing. It brought a rebellion and fighting, and just was death everywhere after that. So it says, you have sinned since the days of Gibeah, meaning this thing that you've called life with me has been really not very good since then. We've had these flashes with David, and then that wasn't completely good. Mm-hmm. And you get to Josiah, and that didn't end exactly the way we had all dreamed it would. And Manasseh was terrible, and he wound up kind of good, so he would flash at the end. It was just little flashes of light. But he says, you've sinned since the days of Gibeah. They have taken their stand there. Will not war against the unjust overtake them at Gibeah? Meaning that, will there be a day where the unjust are defeated? And what God is saying here, no, not until I act, is what he says later. I will discipline them at my discretion. Nations will be gathered against them to put them in bondage for their double iniquity. Okay, so their double sin. What he's referring to is that they oppress the poor and then they eliminate the poor. Okay, don't need them. And that's some of what was happening here. Ephraim will be a well-trained calf that loves to thresh, but I will place a yoke on her fine neck. I will harness Ephraim, Judah will plow, Jacob will do the final plowing. All right, so all of this is referring to, I'm about to put you under exile, and you're going to become animals of the threshing floor. You're just going to be beasts of burden where you go. No freedom, no worship, no nothing. I just lose everything. So he says, sow righteousness for yourselves and reap faithful love. Break up your unplowed ground. It is time to seek the Lord until he comes and sends righteousness on you like the rain. So in this one verse, we get one of these little flashes, see? Sow righteousness for yourselves and reap faithful love. Break up your unplowed ground. It is time to seek the Lord until he comes and sends righteousness on you like rain. Okay, so there's that line again that says, seek the Lord. It is time to seek the Lord. Everything can get turned around literally in a heartbeat when we seek the Lord. Here's one verse that describes this in the midst of this sea of accusation that God is making through the prophet about their sinfulness. But now he's saying, you can have righteousness and you can have hesed, faithful love, which is that's the description of God's love for us and his desired love of us for others. To break your unplowed ground, meaning that there is still a product to have, a produce to grow. There's still extravagance that can be produced out of this. There's something in reserve here that I'm waiting for you to turn back to me to receive. And then he says it's time to seek the Lord. So God wasn't wishing exile upon these people. He just knew the inevitability of it. But he's doing much like John does in Revelation. Every time John goes through a patch that describes how things are going to be, he allows this room for repentance. And he calls the people to repentance. Because ultimately, that's what God's after. And so it's kind of the same thing here. It's time to seek the Lord until he comes and sends righteousness on you like rain. So God is still ready and still desiring a way in which he can rain down his righteousness, which makes us righteous. Okay. Now, fast forward to the New Testament. We know how we gain our righteousness. We are flooded with the redemptive blood of Jesus. So the pictures are nearly the same. Okay? Whatever one you choose, we're washed over by what God is providing. You have plowed wickedness and reaped. See, it goes right back to describing what's the problem is. You've plowed wickedness and reaped injustice. You have eaten the fruit of lies because you have trusted in your own way and in your large numbers of soldiers. So what's he saying here? You're self-governing and it's not working. You're gonna depend on an army, and by this time in their history, they had watched God wipe out 2 armies before they could even get up for breakfast. Mm-hmm. So they know he's reminding them in this. Yeah, an army means nothing to me. It's not going to protect you from the Assyrians, and it certainly is not going to protect you for what I have in store for you. That is necessary for your life with me. There's got to be a cleansing, and that's what this is. That's what the exile is about. Oh, we could go into some other stuff, but I won't. You got to come on Sunday night. I just keep talking in circles about it. Yeah, but there's so much between the exile here and the exile motif that's presented in Genesis about 4 or 5 times. It really is cool. Okay, the roar of battle will rise against your people, and all your fortifications will be demolished in a day of war. Like Shalman's destruction of Beth Arbel, mothers will be dashed to pieces along with their children. Oh, it sounds so terrible. Okay, so this account is talking about Shalman's destruction. It's not mentioned in the Bible anywhere. Can't find it in extra biblical writings anywhere. But obviously it happened at some point in time, and it was memorable for some reason, because who he is writing to would certainly understand, what it is referring to. Mothers will be dashed to pieces along with their children. There is some indication that that's historical later beyond this point that he's writing, but it also has a representative effect, meaning that the mothers are carried off along with their children, and their lives literally become nothing, useless, worthless in the eyes of their captors. Could be wasted in just dashing them to pieces on the rocks. I'm trying to think of I can't think of one right now of a modern idea like this. But what comes close to this that's happening right now is the human trafficking situation we see on the border, and human life is just chattel. It doesn't really matter. 58 people can die in a truck, and it really just doesn't matter. That's the kind of thing that he's referring to here. That's the mind That's what we want to be thinking of when he's talking to this. So it would be done to you, Bethel, because of your extreme evil. At dawn, the king of Israel will be totally destroyed. Okay, so Bethel's significant, right? Jacob named Bethel. Remember when Jacob named Bethel? The angels are coming up and down, taking care of him. Mm-hmm. And it's God's reassurance that here you are, you're on the run for your life, and you're going to a place you shouldn't be leaving, but you've got to leave, kind of thing. I'm going to take care of you. And then when Jacob woke up, there was a rock next to his head where he had been dreaming this, and he stood up rocks on top of that rock and named it Bethel because he said, surely God lives here. And he didn't want to forget where he was. And then we keep coming back to Bethel, and the sad part about it is by this time, Bethel was a worship center of pagan worship. It was a center of Baal worship and Asherah worship. So totally flipped on its head as to what Jacob had experienced. So it said, it will be done to you, Bethel, because of your extreme evil. That's what he's talking about. That's the evil that's been done there. At dawn, the king of Israel will be totally destroyed. So that idea of at dawn means that when this begins to happen, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen quick. Like it's going to happen at sunrise, and it'll be over before you know it. And that's not quite how it happened. They were under siege for a long time, but then once the siege broke, it was over in a matter of days. Mm-hmm. And they were off. They were on their way out of town. Then we get to chapter 11, and this is the beginning of the last section. And in this, we find a total shift of attitude. There's a different. It's almost. This is how I kind of picture this in my mind. So God's been in this courtroom scene, and he's brought all this evidence against the northern kingdom, and then he slips out the side door, or he's in his own mind. And he begins to have these thoughts, and it's his true desire for his people. And it happens, but then we move pretty quickly back to the courtroom scene where he knows that this justice has to be done in order to save his people. Like we talked about at the beginning, he can't just let them do whatever they want to do. That's surely going to bring destruction. So he says, when Israel was a child, I loved him. And out of Egypt I called my son. Israel called to the Egyptians, even as Israel was leaving them. They kept sacrificing to Baals and burnt offerings to idols. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk. So what he's saying here is, I love and care for them, but they cannot keep their eyes off the other man. Okay? He says, Israel said they kept sacrificing, verse 3. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk. So since the very beginning, since Egypt, he has been caring for them, taking them by the hand, but they never knew that I healed them. I led them with human cords, and that's a contrast. He's not treating them like farm animals. He's treating them with gentleness and kindness. He says, I led them with human cords, with ropes of love. To them, I was like one who eases the yoke from their jaws. I bent down to give them food. So you get this picture. They're yoked up like a beast of burden, and God bends over. He removes the yoke off of them, and he's dipping into the feed, and he's feeding them. And that idea of, he says, they never knew. He says, to them I was like one. I bent down to give them. This is what you do before the king. That's the same term that would be used when it would describe bending before the king. So this is picturing God as he is humbling himself to serve his people, which is a fantastic picture in the Old Testament. You don't get that a lot outside of some of the Psalms, and it's not very common there either. But this is pretty Pretty wild, where he bends down and he's giving them food. And it says, Israel will not return to the land of Egypt, and Assyria will be their king. So what he's saying here is that they may wish that at the same time politically, they were trying to cut a deal with Egypt to ally with them against the Assyrians, and that wasn't going well. And so there's an allusion to this. But there's also the illusion of, remember when they were in the desert and Moses was on the mountain and they figured Moses got lost or something happened to him, and they said, oh, he brought us out here to die. It'd be a lot better if we were back in Egypt. And so he's referring to that here, but he says they're not going to get to go to where their heart desires. They're about to go to a place, Assyria, and then he describes how that's going to be. Number one being, they're not going to have the kind of food they're used to. So unclean food meant that there was no ceremony left, because everything about their relationship to each other and their worship to God centered around these meals that were prepared the way God wanted them prepared, and they weren't going to have that. So it was a crushing blow religiously, which they were relying upon, and if it was the way it was going to be, they were going to have to find God in another way.
I had never thought about that, like all about the different ceremonies and stuff. But I was talking to Harris the other day, and we were talking about just culture and our society and stuff like that. And the conversation shifted into Harris brought it up as the way that we celebrate things. He says, we celebrate a holiday for a day. He said they used to have feasts
for a week or more,
and that everything was communal and everything was shared, and there was purpose behind everything, and their entire calendar was based around these times where you communally focused on who God was and what His relationship with us was, and it was everything about their society was revolved around these times of feasting and these times of all the festivals and stuff. That
in the New Testament, it's what drove the Romans crazy. Everywhere else in the Roman Empire, they were working 7 days a week. They were trading, they were buying, they were doing. But not here. In little Israel, they took 1 day a week off. Wouldn't even walk to the next door neighbor's house for fear they were going to be working. They had 7 festivals that took a week each. That's 7 weeks off. I mean, you start to think about how they were viewed by the Romans to think this is a crazy, backward place. That's why they kept saying it. And but it was because that's where they found everything about their heritage. And when he tells them you're not going to have that, it's gone. You're using it as window dressing now in the way that you approach me. You're not even going to have that, and you're really going to learn what this was really all about. And they do until they get back, and then it doesn't go quite like it should after having spent 75 years. If God gives you 75 years to think about something, you ought to be able to figure it out. Okay, so a sword will whirl through the cities. And that reminds me of Genesis, where Adam and Eve were exiled from the garden, and there was the flaming swords of the cherubim there to guard. Now it's like these same whirling swords are there to do what we imagine they might do if you tried to approach them at Eden. They're whirling through the cities. It will destroy and devour the bars of its gates, meaning there will be no security. You can't provide any security for this. It will destroy because of their schemes. My people are bent on turning from me, though they call to him on high. He will not exalt them at all. So he's saying their hearts, they're doing all the right things, but their heart's not right. And then, verse 8, he goes through all of that and he says, how can I give you up? And you could hear the tears in his voice. I mean, really, can't you? How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I surrender you, Israel? How can I make you like Adama? How can I treat you like Zeboim? So these are two cities that were collateral damage when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. So they just went right along. They were destroyed with them. When the fire came down, it was indiscriminate. And so these were two cities, and he said, how can I make you like that, where you're just so insignificant that your destruction won't matter to anybody? I can't do that. He says, I have had a change of heart. My compassion is stirred. I will not vent the full fury of my anger. Okay, so here is God limiting. And we have a hard time with trying to figure out how can God do that? And God is all in all the time. Well, God can do whatever He wants to do. But this is one of those moments where we discover that there are times both like this where He throttles back His anger, and there's also times where He has to throttle back His presence so that we can know Him. So He did that with Moses on the mountain is the most readily available example. He tells Moses that I'm going to allow a certain part of me to be known in a way that is going to overwhelm your senses about who I am. And He does. And so much so that he shines like the sun when He's coming down the mountain. So this is God again. He's limiting Himself for the good of His compassion, for the sake of His compassion for us or for His people. I will not vent the full fury of my anger. I will not turn back to destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not man, the Holy One among you. So this is something that we don't find as a means of illustrating God's presence until we go all the way back to Exodus. And then we have these moments along the way with Elijah where God settles in there, and Mount Carmel and on the mountain. And there's a couple other places in 1st and 2nd Kings where we experience God up close and personal. But what He's saying is, I'm a God and not a man, the Holy One among you, and I will not come in rage. Now this, to me, this is messianic in a lot of ways. Jesus comes, and He comes as God with us, and He doesn't come with rage. He comes with compassion and mercy, and He makes the presence of God known fully, because He says, if you know me, you know God. It's a full revelation here. So God has had to throttle back, because how can God exist in the body of a man unless He's chosen to do it in a way to show us really the best of who He is. And then we ultimately see His wrath and anger that is also an expression of love poured out on His Son. We get the whole picture. Mm-hmm. It's just that part of it's meant for us and part of it's meant for Him. And in that, we come together because of that and are able to have this life with God that He's always intended. That's very simplified, but it's all we're going to do tonight. It's richer than that. He says, then they will follow the Lord. He will roar like a lion. And when He roars, His children will come trembling from the west. They will be roused like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria. Then they will settle in their homes. This is the Lord's declaration. Ephraim, and then that's the end of that. Verse 12 shifts gears again. So what he describes in 10 and 11, the last part of 10 and 11, is that when this exile is over, I'm going to roar, and they're all going to return. Okay? So the picture there is, I'm in control of this, and when the day comes, I'm going to have my people back where I want them, how I want them, made new, basically, through their exile. So it's, verse 12 really goes more with chapter 12. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it is the first verse of chapter 12. So Ephraim surrounds me with lies, the house of Israel with deceit. Judah still wanders with God and is faithful to the holy ones. I think that's the last verse that gives any cred to Judah, because after this he starts talking about how they're doing wrong too. So 12. Ephraim chases the wind and pursues the east wind. He continually multiplies lies and violence. He makes a covenant with Assyria, and olive oil is carried to Egypt. The Lord also has a dispute with Judah. Here we go. He's about to punish Jacob according to his conduct. He will repay him based on his actions. In the womb, he grasped his brother's heel, and as an adult, he wrestled with God. So he's describing here, all the way back at that last verse of 11, just what they're doing here. They're chasing after, and when it says the east wind, it means they're looking east to Assyria, hoping that they're going to be the ones that actually save them and they're actually become their captors. They look to Egypt. Olive oil was one of the most valuable things that they had to trade. They were looking to Egypt to try to buy their support. It didn't happen. And then he says, Judah's got a problem. They're misbehaving too. And then he describes the basis of all of this. Well, Jacob in the womb, he was grasping at his brother's heel. And we just talked about this on Sunday night. But he's the little trickster that's trying to trip up his older brother even before they're born. And then he goes on, and as an adult, he wrestled with God. It says, Jacob struggled with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. So there's a little bit of commentary here, because at the end of the episode where Jacob wrestles with God, we were talking about this the other day, God pretty much tells Jacob, hey, you've won this thing. But I've got to still put a stop to this self-directive attitude that you have of trying to secure your own blessing. He says, you're pretty good at struggling with me, but I've still got the upper hand, literally. He punches him in the groin and knocks his hip out of socket. And lo and behold, one more child for Jacob, and that was it after that. It's like he was not going to be able to provide the blessing on his own anymore or try to steal it on his own. He was going to have to rely on God. And that became a struggle for him for the rest of his life and ultimately for all of his offspring. So he's describing this, and he says, Jacob struggled with the angel, referring to that incident, and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He found him at Bethel, which we talked about before, and there he spoke with him. The Lord, the God of armies, the Lord is my name. That's what he said to him at Bethel. But you must return to your God, maintain love and justice, and always put your hope in God. So this is a little reminder of, it's a condensed version of what God is wishing for his people. Maintain love and justice, you could equate with love your neighbor, okay? And always put your hope in God, you could equate with loving God with all you have, because that's your hope. So it's a condensed summary of all that God desired of his people. But the way we do that is to return to him first. And at the moment, that's not in their game plan. Verse 7, a merchant loves to exhort with dishonest scales in his hands, but Ephraim thinks, how rich I have become. I made it all myself. Yeah, that sounds familiar too. And how did he's saying, when they say that, how did they do that? Because they cheated people. I made it all myself. In all my earnings, no one can find any inequity in me that I can be punished for. And he says that with exclamation points. And what he's describing there is the irony of that. That's what they say, but God knows. They've been cheating the whole time. Cheating with who? Cheating one another, but also cheating God. Earlier, 2 or 3 chapters earlier, he says, I provide all this stuff. But they're giving this other God credit. And it's the same thing that's happening here. He says they're saying that they've done all this on their own. And there's no way anybody can say that we've done anything wrong to get it. And God is saying, what are you talking about?
It was interesting when you talked earlier about like the idea of stepping out and all this kind of stuff. We on Sunday morning in Kings went through a verse, and it says that the Israelites devoted themselves, and it says that the translation is more like they sold themselves.
Yeah.
Or it was like a transactionary.
Yeah.
Like you said, they were getting something out of it. They were selling themselves for whatever reason.
Yeah, because giving devotion to another, it's binding. I mean, it's not a non-binding idea where I'm going to be devoted today and not tomorrow. It's not the way that they would think about that at all. That's right. Yeah, and sold themselves. And that's what had happened here for sure. He says, I have been the Lord your God ever since the land of Egypt. I will make you live in tents again, as in the festival days. I will speak through the prophets and grant my visions. I will give parables to the prophets. Since Gilead is full of evil, they will certainly come to nothing. They sacrifice bulls in Gilgal. Even their altars will be like piles of rocks on the furrows of the field. So he's saying here, look, you're gonna be wanderers again in tents in this exile period, and the prophets are going to explain all this to you, and you're going to know, and the evil that has certainly been done will continue to be done because you're not learning your lesson. He says Jacob fled the territory of Aram. Israel worked to earn a wife. He tended flocks for a wife. The Lord brought Israel from Egypt by a prophet, and Israel was tended by a prophet. Ephraim has provoked bitter anger, so his Lord will leave his blood guilt on him and repay him for his contempt. So what he's saying here is that, you remember the whole story, Jacob getting his wives, okay? He was cheated, but he went ahead and he did the hard work to get the wife that had really been chosen for him. And then also he speaks here of Moses. And Moses had to do it the hard way too. And both are considered prophets within the Old Testament tradition. And he mentions just previously to that, I'm providing you prophets to declare to you exactly what you're to do, but you're not going to listen to them. You're going to continue to do the things that raw my anger. Ephraim has provoked bitter anger, so his Lord will leave his blood guilt upon him. In the Old Testament, there's a blood guilt that cannot be washed away. And then that whole idea of blood guilt in the Old Testament is replaced by the blood of Calvary that does wash. Okay. So that's just a little. There's several places in the Old Testament that describe blood guilt, and that's it contrasts right back to Jesus. When Ephraim spoke, he was trembling. He was exalted in Israel, but he incurred guilt through Baal and died. So this is what he's describing. He was once exalted, but now he's dead because of his worship of Baal. Now they continue to sin and make themselves a cast image, idols skillfully made from their silver, all of them the work of craftsmen. Now, the way that he's thinking of this is the moment that they started worshiping Baal, they died. So everything that he's describing here, spiritually, they were dead. So everything that he's describing here is just wasted folly. They're using up time, resources, skill, all these things to cast these images that have never really meant anything. They're dead themselves. But not only that, the people are really dead because they've become involved in this pagan worship. People say about them, let the men who sacrifice kiss the calves. Therefore, they will be like the morning mist, like the early dew that vanishes, like chaff blown from the threshing floor, or like smoke from a window. This saying that he's talking about here is you gave homage to the idol by kissing it. In some traditions today, people venerate the cross of Christ. They'll kiss the feet or something like that on a crucifix. So it's the same kind of devotion or dedication that he's talking about. And those people that do that are just a vapor of a life. There's nothing there that would matter in that devotion. But ultimately, as he's already said, but that it matters to me. You matter to me. You're my child, and I want you back.
when we started looking at kings as well, you know, my whole life growing up, you know, we were taught that God, you know, God doesn't like, he's a jealous God, and he doesn't like for any other gods to be worshipped, and this very elementary understanding of that. But then on top of that, as you understand what is involved in worship of these other gods, you're talking about human sacrifices, you're talking about children being burned alive, you're talking about these unbelievably hideous things that they would do to one another and all of this. I mean, it's not just a matter of I'm kneeling, like this juvenile version of I'm kneeling before this statue. There was unbelievable stuff that went along with the worship of all of these other gods.
Yeah, just the cutting itself.
Mm-hmm.
There's Biblical Archaeological Society magazine. They were describing this one time,
Mm-hmm.
and how they would come and cut, and they could feel just vats of human blood just from cutting. And that's one of the ways that they would worship.
Mm-hmm.
Nowhere does God. I mean, it's just amazing. It really is so unique. This life that God brought forth out of nothing. He just told Abraham to go where I tell you to go and be a blessing. There was nothing else required of Abraham at all to know the blessing of God and the direction and purposes of God. Let's see. Verse 4 says, I have been the Lord your God ever since the land of Egypt. You know no God but me, and no Savior exists besides me. I knew you in the wilderness, in the land of the drought. When they had pasture, they became satisfied. They were satisfied, and their hearts became proud. So this is kind of the way it works. God calls them out. He gives them a land to themselves. He carries them through the bad times. The rain begins to pour, and they begin to get crops. And they became real full of themselves for something that they had nothing to do with. I mean, literally and soon, they didn't make it rain. They can't make the plants grow. They were just in the right place at the right time of God's blessing. He says, therefore they forgot me. Sounds like 2022 America.
Mm-hmm.
You know, none of it. In fact, let's eliminate it. Let's forget that it's a part of our history. Let's destroy the history even, which is amazing to me. I mean, and that's really the same thing. We're just going to forget about him. If we can get it out of our history, if we can teach something different, if we can make it irrelevant to life, then we could certainly say that we have done this ourselves.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a mission and intent of the enemy.
Oh yeah, yeah. You can see it as, I mean, when you know these things, you can see it.
Right, in plain sight.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we do our battle with powers and principalities of the air. And that's a battle that God has to fight for us. We don't operate in that realm, but a lot of that spills over into here. And He has given us armor to wear and an ability to come against it. And He said we would prevail against it. Yeah. So I will be like a lion to them. I will lurk like a leopard on the path. I will attack them like a bear robbed her cubs and tear open the rib cage over their hearts. This is really tough here. I will devour them there like a lioness, like a wild beast that will rip them open. I will destroy you, Israel. You have no help but me. So what he's saying here is this, man. You keep this up and your life, this is kind of the thinking. This is how I think this is where this goes. God no more can let that run wild in the world as anything else. Not simply because it's evil, but because God on the cosmic stage has said, these are my people. Okay? And they've made that claim for hundreds of years. And now all of a sudden, they're behaving this way and you're just going to let them get away with it? And are you going to let them spread this kind of idolatry and really hatred toward you? In Isaiah, we'll find that word a few times. And so God says, no, I can't do that. I can't do that for my own glory or for their sake. So something's got to be done here. I still think it's interesting that the exile is what he chooses. It's the soft punch that occurs in other areas before this, that it actually worked for a time. And so anyway, Isaiah, I can't wait to get to Isaiah next week, because we will certainly examine those ideas a lot more. Let's see. Where now is your king, that they may save you in all your cities, and the rulers you demanded, saying, give me a king and leaders. Remember when they demanded of Samuel, we want a king. And God said, I'm going to give you one, but you're not going to like it. Yeah. So he said, give me that. It says, I will give you a king in my anger and take away a king in my wrath. So he's describing, all right, you can have this king, but now I'm taking away a king, and it's going the pain of this is really going to hurt.
It just seems, because it's so counterintuitive to what God is. Everything about what God does is to set them apart. And all they're doing is worried about, give us a king so we can be like other
Be nations. Like everybody else.
Literally the opposite of what God wants them to do is the reason.
And when you look around at the time, there was not a whole lot special about everybody else. It was not a good period in human history, probably. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Philistines ruled the neighborhood because they were physically bigger. Mm-hmm. I mean, they had come. Most people believe they came from the Macedonian area, southern Europe area, where the stature was bigger. Yep. And you get around the lower Mediterranean area, and even still today, they're a small stature people. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they wanted something that totally began this process of turning away from God, and finally that turning away is resulting in his wrath. So Ephraim's guilt is preserved, his sin is stored up, labor pains come on him. He is not a wise son. When the time comes, he will not be born. So there's a lot of mixed metaphors in there. And from the very beginning, Hosea has had a lot of poetic license to do that. Because a lot of this stuff you're trying to, all right, labor pains will come on him. He is not a wise man. That would make sense. When the time comes, he will not be born. To be honest, that verse is a mystery, other than he is not a wise son. Even the two commentaries I was reading just couldn't make sense of what was happening there. I will ransom them from the power of Sheol. I will redeem them from death. Death, where are your barbs? Sheol, where is your sting? Compassion is hidden from my eyes. So, that's another confusion one with that last line. But what, in verse 14, we get this little flash again saying that it's the same thing as limiting his wrath earlier, that he was going to choke it, he was going to let some of it vent off. I thought that was an interesting idea. But and the same thing is happening here. I'm not going to allow you to go to the place of the dead through this. So God's kind of self-describing how he's going to allow for a remnant to prevail through all of this. I will redeem them from death, and death. And then we've got this. It almost is the same that Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15. Death, where are your barbs, or where's your victory? Mm-hmm. Where's your sting? So, the coming judgment is how the CSB has this subheaded, but it says, although he flourishes among his brothers, an east wind will come. Assyria comes out of the east. That's what that keeps meaning. Mm-hmm. A wind from the Lord rising up in the desert. His water source will fail, and his spring will run dry. The wind will plunder the treasury of every precious item. So he's describing here, Assyria's going to come. There's going to be a siege on Samaria, and they'll ultimately plunder the whole place. Samaria will bear her guilt because she rebelled against her God. They will fall by the sword. Their children will be dashed to pieces, and their pregnant women ripped open. And that's, it's those kind of lines that have the unbelievers say, see, that's not the kind of God I want to serve. But what he's describing there is a very poetic way of saying that life is going to be miserable, even for the most innocent. And that's yeah. Now you can say, well, still it's bad, but from a 30,000 foot view, it's not. It could be worse. They could be in Sheol. They could be dead. But God is determined not for that not to happen. That His program is going to persist in these people, and there's no plan B for any of this. He's going to maintain His promise. So here we have a plea to repent. Israel, return to the Lord your God, for you have stumbled in your iniquity. Take words of repentance with you and return to the Lord. Say to Him, forgive all our iniquity and accept what is good, so that we may repay you with praise from our lips. All right, so here we have good things. This is a good passage. He says, return. This is the prophet speaking now. God's not speaking. The prophet speaking. He's asking them or demanding that they return to the Lord your God. You've made a mistake. You've stumbled. Okay? It's almost as if it refers kind of the whole thing of Jacob being the heel grabber. Something has grabbed your heel and has caused you to stumble. There's been a deceiver among you. Okay? Because that's really what Jacob was. He deceived his brother twice. Although there's a different word for that in Hebrew. The Satan is the deceiver. That's Satan. And the serpent was a deceiver. So Jacob kind of gets thrown in that batch sometimes for the way that he behaved. And now it's all being kind of directed back. You've stumbled. You've been tripped up in your iniquity toward God. So take words of repentance with you. And what does he mean by that? You're going into exile. Start now repenting of all of this. Don't wait. It's kind of what Jeremiah has a different way of saying it, but we're going to talk about that when we get to Jeremiah. Take these words of repentance with you and return to the Lord. Doesn't mean you're going to be in the land, but that doesn't keep you from returning to the Lord. Say to Him, forgive all our iniquity and accept what is good, so that we may repay you with the praise from our lips. So what is good? Accept what is good, and he's speaking of their worship. So now we're getting this picture where the return to God is going to be a worshipful, heart-filled return to Him. And that's ultimately what God's looking for. There's an obedience to that not, like as Oswald Chambers says, not for the sake of being obedient, but there's an obedience to that because we know that it draws us near to the heart of God. And that is the only path there. We have to do that in order to have the ends that we want, and that's to be near to God. So he says, Assyria will not save us. We will not ride on horses, and we will no longer proclaim our gods to the work of our hands, for the fatherless receives compassion in you. So he's saying here, the prophet is saying to them, recognize this truth. Assyria is not going to save you. When they show up, it's going to be to destroy you. Okay? You're not going to leave on horses. Horses were the animals of victory and conquest. Okay? They weren't going to be on any animals leaving. They were just going to be walking out on their own feet. And he says, when you do that, no longer proclaim the plurality of gods. Leave your syncretic worship behind, meaning don't worship Yahweh, don't worship Baal, don't worship Asherah, don't worship all these gods at the same time and think that you're doing the right thing. No longer proclaim our gods, but the one God. Okay. So he says, I will heal their apostasy. I will freely love them, for my anger will have turned from him. I will be like a dew to Israel. He will blossom like the lily and take root like the cedars of Lebanon. So rain was not always good, because rain could come and wash things away in an arid climate like that. But the dew every morning was sometimes like the dew we get. And if you've ever been out west during the cooler months of the year, and it warms up and it gets cool, the ground is blanketed with dew just from the thermal climb that happens. And that was the preferable way to water your garden, was because you didn't have to worry about it getting washed away. Well, this is kind of like that. I will be like the dew to Israel. I'm going to come gently. I'm going to cover them. I'm going to provide what they need. And he will blossom like the lily and take root like the cedars of Lebanon. His new branches will spread, and his splendor will be like the olive tree. All of this is describing the return now. His fragrance like the forest of Lebanon. The people will return and live beneath his shade. They will grow grain and blossom like the vine. His renown will be like the wine of Lebanon. So this verse is akin to Micah's verse, every man will sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and there will be war no more. Okay, so that's kind of what it is here. He's describing a return to the place where God has chosen for him, and there's going to be peace and provision. It says, Ephraim, why should I have anything more to do with idols? It is I who answer and watch over him. I like a flourishing pine tree. Your fruit comes from me. I am like a flourishing pine tree. So he's describing, same thing we've been talking about. No more idols. I'm your caretaker. I'm providing what you need. Let whoever is wise understand these things, and whoever is insightful recognize them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the righteous walk in him, but the rebellious stumble in them. So that's the end. So it's he kind of gives a little poem here at the end to kind of sum everything up. It reads a little differently than literarily in the Hebrew than it does all the passages that provide accusation. And it's meant to do that. It's meant to build one line upon the other, so you begin to feel the expansion that God is bringing. So literarily, it has its own device of helping the Hebrew reader, and those smarter than me that have learned the Hebrew, it helps them kind of feel by reading the expanse of what God is doing. And so at the end, as always, nearly always, Joel doesn't have. We're not going to get to Joel now. Thank goodness. At the end, we're left always with the program of hope and compassion and promise that God has for his people. When we get to Isaiah, there's a whole section at the end where these songs are repeated with the same theme, and a lot of that is to reiterate. And some scholars believe that they were written at different times, so they really would not have even overlapped. They were collected later for those that were coming out of exile to have together. But either way, they kind of repeat the same things to help us see in different language and in different metaphors just exactly how God is going to do this. And ultimately, the servant songs in Isaiah will point directly to Christ and his life and his cross and his resurrection. Which is what we'll do next. And I still haven't figured out how I'm going to do it, because we still got to do Jeremiah just so we can get to the next section of prophets. So it's a lot.
You start at the beginning of Isaiah?
Yeah. I'm going to start at the beginning. And there's some parts of Isaiah that are out of order, but I don't think I'm going to take them out of order. I mean, scholars think that they're kind of placed out of order because it was edited together. Some scholars believe it was one Isaiah. Some believe there was actually two different Isaiahs at different periods that wrote. There's actually some theory now that says 3, maybe 4.
He like to talk.
But huh?
66 chapters, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a lot.
He like to talk.
Yeah.
Can you imagine sitting in a room?
Yeah, we'll probably summarize some of those songs. They're like 6. They're like 6 stanzas, and then they repeat, and then they repeat the same thing, just using different words. So we'll probably summarize a lot of that, so we don't stay here till Christmas with Isaiah.
How long did he live?
He lived a long time. Well, if it's one author, yeah, he lived a long time. If it's more than one, one that was before exile and one that went into exile, then we don't really know. But it's a long period of time. It's
Does it say that the book of Isaiah had several authors?
the Bible.
Yeah.
No, this is scholars looking at it, and they take language and style, and they say, man, this, you get to this point, and this language and the style is totally different from this. So they look at it and they think, oh, it must have been 2 because it's so different. But it could have been the same guy, and he's lived a while, and he's had another influence, and so he's changed his writing style. I'm certainly glad I changed mine from the time I was in high school to the time I got my master's degree, or I would have made not very good grades. So I don't know. It really doesn't matter to us so much because we're going to look at it, and we're kind of looking at all this in a commentary format. How does it speak to us? And so it doesn't matter what order it's in; it's still going to speak to us. The historical portions of it are definitely all in order. It's the more poetic portions that are spread through the last third and the middle third. They're just lessons for us. So if you got anything, any favorite subjects or passages in Isaiah that you want to be sure that we don't jump over, let me know. Because I'm going to try not to. The reason why I like doing it this way is most people never read the minor prophets. We read portions of Isaiah, and we got our favorite passages in Jeremiah, but we never really read the whole thing. And I think it's valuable for us to read and look. And just like this, Hosea is not any fun to really read because it's so oppressive. By the time you get to chapter 12, you're thinking, when is this drudgery ever going to end? He's constantly talking about all these terrible things that are going to happen and why they happen. And well, we don't need to be reminded again, Hosea, why it's this way. But they did need to be reminded over and over again that this was serious business that they were entertaining and had been entertaining in the country for hundreds of years. And along the way, God had constantly, in every way imaginable, he found ways to correct it, and they never took. Even to the point of guaranteeing Ahab a victory, so that he could see that God was his God, but Ahab, in his hard-heartedness, in the process, the prophet came and said, "No, you're going to die now," and so. There's just all these different ways in which God always came in and said, I'm going to show you who I am. And this is the same, I'm the same that I was in the desert when I brought them out of Egypt. I haven't changed a bit. Everything I did for them, I'm going to do for you, and I'm going to show you the truth of who I am. And you're going to want to come back to me, was the idea. Okay, well, he provides this defeat this victory for Ahab. And the one thing that God told Ahab to do is said, get rid of that king because he's going to cause trouble later. That was the only reason. He didn't hate Ben-Hadad. He just knew that he was going to raise his head later and cause trouble. Well, what's he do? He makes a deal with Ben-Hadad. I tell you what, you come on back down to our place, and we're going to figure out a trade arrangement so we can both do okay after this. And lo and behold, God shows up with a prophet and tells him, you did the wrong thing, so you can rest assured you're going to die by his hand. And ultimately, well, it doesn't exactly. He doesn't die the direct result of Benadad's hand, but he does die by his army. So he gives opportunity, and then we squander the opportunity, and God says, see, you've put me in this place where I still have to be, and still am, the God who is in control of this. And until you realize that I'm in control, these things are going to continue to raise up in your life. And it's going to be a constant burden for you. It's going to bring sin and death and destruction, and you're going to be anxious, and you're going to look for me, and you're not going to be able to find me because you can't hear my voice anymore. I mean, Isaiah gets into all of that. All of that happens, and he warns them over and over again. And then we look to Jesus, and he comes as presenting himself as the full image of God, and we can see and we can hear, and that's why he's so. Jesus is almost stoic when he says to those you who have ears to hear, let them hear, because he knows that even though he's here now, there's still going to be people that are not going to hear, not going to see, and their hearts are never going to turn back. And they're God's people. And tough one. That's a tough one. For God.
I was at a youth camp. I was young, and the preacher said, there's many of you in this room